Today I'm going to give a short talk about considering scope at the review planning stage. So we're really talking about from review conception to right up to the publication of the protocol. So this session, I'm just going to give an overview of what we mean by scope, what to consider before even doing a review, the aims and objectives section, how to define scope with the PICO inclusion criteria, and also just considering your analysis, which I'll touch a little bit on, how to consider analysis planning at the protocol stage. So firstly, I guess it's important to define what scope is, and you can see from my terrible image on the right-hand side here, try to make a pun out of it, of research scope. But the way I sort of like to think about scope is really what your research ambition is versus your realities and constraints and resources. So what are the parameters and boundaries of your systematic review? And by having the right scope, you should be able to accurately draw conclusions without having to include every single thing. So you should be able to reach the same conclusion as you would if you had included all the data that's out there. So just as an example, you can see that this blacked out image, we don't have all the info, so we don't know what it is. Again, we have a very narrow bit of information here, and it's not really helpful. But just by targeting the right point with the right scope, we can see that this is a picture of a parrot. So I guess one of the questions is then why not just include everything and get the most accurate picture that you can? Well, as with all scientific research, there's this balance between ambition and what's actually feasible. So, and it's important to also consider that we have to be timely with our research. So publish when these questions are most important. And also from a particularly selfish point of view, I guess, is also to publish before another research team gets to it, and that question is already answered. But there's also resource constraints, there's time constraints, and we have to remember that a lot of Cochrane authors are mostly volunteers, so they can't dedicate 9 to 5 days a week to systematic review. So I've just got a few questions for people, so feel free to put your responses in the chat, and whilst you're putting in those responses, I'll work out how to get the chat up for myself. But my first question is, how do you think scope impacts the review development process? Yeah, so we have responses flooding in. So quite a few people have put PICO. So yeah, so I think the PICO inclusion criteria is definitely how we sort of set the boundaries of the scope of our review. So by using that inclusion criteria, and not only PICO, but also the types of studies that we include, we can have a narrow or really broad review. Someone has put that impacts all stages of the review. I'm not saying there is a right answer here, but that would be the answer that I would give as well. And hopefully you will find out why with this presentation, and also moving ahead, that, yeah, when you're defining scope, we're very much focused on your inclusion criteria, but how it impacts the review development process is from right at the start, from conception to right when you have that final manuscript out. And even looking further ahead with regards to review updates and so forth, it also impacts that. other people have put it determines your review author team. Yep, I think that's particularly important. And in selecting synthesis technique, yep, so type of review you might do as well. That's also very important. That's probably a good pointer for me now to say that for this particular webinar, I'm very much going to be focused on standard intervention reviews, but that's not to say that scope doesn't have an impact on qualitative reviews, on diagnostic test accuracy, and so forth, and some other valid comments coming through as well. But yeah, I can't go through them all, unfortunately. So now this is the final question and answer for me. I'm not going to make everyone do all the work for me here, but I just want people to consider as well. So what's the advantages and disadvantages of having a really wide scope in a systematic review? And also conversely, and bear in mind, it might not necessarily be the disadvantages of having a wider scope means is an advantage for having a narrow scope. But yeah, what are the advantages and disadvantages of also having a systematic review with quite a narrow scope? So we've got a few responses now, and I think most people are converging to sort of the same conclusions. So obviously, if you have a wider scope, all the evidence is in one place, and we can target multiple questions with that. But one of the significant disadvantages is it would take much longer to complete, and you have to ask yourselves, is it actually helpful and useful to the stakeholders? Because at the end of the day, especially with Cochrane reviews, they're meant to be usable, easy to summarize, and easy to interpret for all stakeholders out there. And conversely, with narrow, with reviews with a narrow scope, they're much more focused, but also we can have very targeted questions that can be completed in a shorter amount of time. So thinking of different types of reviews, for example, when we think about scoping reviews, or when we're dealing like with the COVID pandemic, when we needed answers very quickly, and we also are aware that little research has been done on those specific questions. But again, great responses in the chat, so I encourage everyone to look at other people's answers there, and I might reflect back on this later after I wrap up. As well, I just want to add, feel free to put questions in the chat as we go along, and I'll address them at the end of my presentation. I've also put in the chat just the relevant Cochrane Handbook table that sort of summarizes the advantages and disadvantages of having a review of a wide or narrow scope. So let's begin. So what should we consider even before doing a review? Well, this is quite a helpful acronym when considering the formulation of your review questions. So is it feasible? Is it interesting? Is it novel, ethical, and relevant? So an old boss of mine was a co-editor of a journal. I'm keeping this anonymous because it's not the best editorial practices, but it's definitely not any Cochrane editors, as far as I'm aware, that do this. But they used to say that if they read the title and it's boring, they'll just chuck out the manuscript. So they don't even read beyond that. But I guess the point of that is the research has to be especially relevant and answering a specific gap out there. So I guess before even conducting the review, when you're considering to do one, you as a review author need to conduct your own research on what are the outstanding questions remaining. Are there existing systematic reviews, and have they covered the bare bones, or is there outstanding questions left? Is there significant research that has been conducted that might change conclusions of previous reviews published out there? and also thinking about stakeholders as well. So what are the important questions for all stakeholders? So users of the intervention, policymakers, people that are going to be buying and distributing and implementing the intervention. So that brings on the importance of a diverse author team that includes potential stakeholders that might know these questions that you may not yourselves. And it's also important in identifying research gaps. And this is all relevant for the review planning stage for when you write up your background section, because your background section is really the space to justify why you're doing this particular systematic review. And there's a great webinar, and I'm not only saying it's great because it's my boss who did it, but Toby Lesson did a webinar a couple of months ago on the background section that I encourage people to look at if you haven't already. And we in Cochrane love going back to checklists and tick boxes. So the MISIR standards themselves have what every Cochrane review should in terms of scope. So in terms of formulating the review question, essentially, yeah, the review question has to be relevant and tackle key questions out there and not basically be research waste. And another important aspect is that we should also always consider potential adverse effects of interventions and not just the benefits, which is as well important for scope. So onto the next stage. So imagine if you're writing out the protocol, you've done your background section. Now we move on to the aim and objectives. So again, reflecting back on what makes the review useful, what's your actual research question, and not only about thinking why bother with the review and what is you're trying to answer that is not already out there, so what is novel, but also thinking about are all objectives necessary. So it's very easy as review authors, and I've done this in the past, is to look at previous reviews that we consider to be quite good and quite gold standard reviews and be like, oh, well, they've done this, so I'm going to copy them because they know what they're doing. But don't have any unnecessary objectives just because they have been there in previous reviews. And what I mean by this is you normally have the standard 3 formats of objectives when you come to writing an intervention review. So the first standard format is, does drug A work versus nothing / placebo? The second standard is, does drug A work versus drug B? And the third one is, does drug A at a particular dose work versus drug A at another dose? And bear in mind that these objectives are not always important for a particular intervention. And finally, are effect modifiers of particular interest. So you may want to include in your objectives as a particular one about exploring heterogeneity. So not only might it be useful to know, does the intervention work or not, but for particularly complex interventions, you might want to know how an intervention achieves its effect for it to be useful. And that's especially true for a lot of complex interventions that have a lot of implementation science, whereby you start thinking, does this particular intervention work in a certain population on particular outcomes versus others? And that brings me to logic models. So logic models are a great way to help unpick complex interventions. And they're not only useful for the reader in understanding what you're actually going on about when you're talking about an intervention and what the anticipated effects are of that intervention, but it's useful for the review author team as well to unpick those interventions. How do we define the interventions? Are there any meaningful categories that we can clump interventions into? And I'll come back to that later when we talk about PICO. but also the impact they have on the outcomes, and then how you go forth to select these outcomes. So this logic model is on, and as Rachel mentioned earlier, I've got a particular bias for malaria reviews, but I've made sure not to pick any of my own reviews here. But anyway, this is a logic model from a review on mosquito aquatic habitat modification and manipulation interventions to control malaria, conducted by Martello et al., published in 2022. Now we go back, so we move ahead. Next bit in the method section of your protocol is the PICO inclusion criteria. So the point of this image is to think about cycling back. So when you're writing your review, it's important to keep it interesting and to make it flow like a story. So everything should be justified by what you've written in the past, and especially true of the PICO inclusion criteria. So your participants' intervention, comparators, and outcomes that you choose to define the scope of your review should make sense from how you justified why this review should even be conducted in the background section. And also it should be justified by your aim and objectives. So does your definition of the boundaries of this review actually meet what you aim to achieve in the review? And like I said, a really key bit in this is to accurately define interventions, comparators, and outcomes. And what I've seen a lot of, especially, is outcomes that are poorly defined and having too many outcomes. So Cochrane Handbook recommends considering having a maximum of 7 outcomes in your summary of findings tables, but I would extend this to consider having a maximum of 7 outcomes, including adverse events in your entire review, if possible. And also thinking about hierarchy of scales for certain outcomes is important here and is often missed in protocols. Now, like I said, again, bias towards malaria reviews. So this is a table taken from House Modifications for Preventing Malaria, which is done by Fox et al., published in 2022. But this is just to illustrate that sometimes for complex interventions, as I said in a few slides before, it's helpful to think about having meaningful categories to clump them in, because then it makes the scope easier in terms of later stages in the review development, when you're thinking about your comparators, your grade tables, and your analysis. You can then have these specific categories that may not be standard categories recognized in this particular example. They may not be standard categories recognized in the malaria world, but they're the ones that are clearly defined within the bounds of your review. But they'll help you further along when planning your analysis and so forth. So this is the final slide with content in it. And I don't want to touch on this too much because I'm also going to be talking about the analysis in great detail in a later workshop on the same topic of scope. But really, what I want to put across here is again the importance of cycling back and making your story flow. And when you're outlining your analysis in the protocol stage, it's really asking, does your analysis match your objectives? So you're actually doing meaningful analyses that answer the question that you set out, or are you just including every possible analysis under the sun? And an important criteria to think about here is that not all outcomes might be important for all comparators. I've seen this in quite a few reviews recently. So as an example, there's a review that I was helping with development on cell salvage. I can't remember the full exact title of it, but essentially it was quite a large scope review that included many different clinical specialties. And within that, each clinical specialties had outcomes that were important to that specific specialty that weren't important to others. And what the reviews authors did quite rightly is they only addressed specific outcomes for those specific specialties in their analysis and didn't just include every single outcome for every single bit of comparison. And this is important to consider when you have quite a large scope review, to make sure that it isn't already, to make sure it doesn't get more bloated than it already is. But again, this is like a mini advert, this slide for a workshop that I'll touch upon later. But really, so the key points are scope impacts review development in many ways, and scope, in fact, it impacts every single stage of developing a review. The key points really should be that each section of your protocol should flow like a story, and it should make sense about what decisions you've made moving ahead with the aims and objectives because of what you said in the background about justifying why this review needs to be done, and so forth with your PICO inclusion criteria. So I hope I've illustrated from this brief presentation that considering and appropriately defining scope is essential in the planning stage, because it has large implications moving ahead with the rest of review development. And at the end of the day, all this to say that your review should be relevant and also interesting. So yeah, I just wanted to flag as well that we're going into this in a much greater detail at the Cochrane Colloquium, and not only thinking about scope at the planning stage, but also within the completion of systematic reviews. So thinking about the write-up of your results, discussion and summary versions. So I hope everyone can attend that.